My biggest recommendation there is just find some really smart people and say, hey, let's start a WhatsApp group or some message group and start sending around stuff that we find. And what you'll find is that like the power of 5 or 10 people to kind of dig up information is going to be so much more than what you can find yourself just digging around on the internet.
Welcome to the Wild West Real Estate Podcast. And now, here's your host, Mark Hinteman. Today's guest is host of the Passive Investing Show. He's an entrepreneur, technologist, investor, author of multiple books, and multifamily syndicator at Bar Down Investments. I'd like to welcome Jay Scott.
Hey, Mark. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming on. I'm very excited to jump in. I admire your work, your books, and you're always extremely knowledgeable on the economy. So I think we'll have a fun conversation ahead of us.
Excellent.
So yeah, why don't we start from like the beginning? How did you wade your way into real estate?
Yeah, it's not an exciting story. So I was an engineer and business guy for a long time, worked in Northern California, did the tech thing. And back in 2008, in 2006, met my wife. And in 2008, we decided to get married. And at that time, she was traveling 3.5 weeks a month for her job. I was working ridiculous hours at my job. And it just didn't make sense for us to kind of keep up this crazy schedule if we wanted to get married and start a family. So 2008, we just kind of up and quit our jobs, moved across the country back to the East Coast. And we had no idea what we were going to do. But one day my wife was literally watching an HGTV show sitting in our basement and said, let's flip a house. We were a couple months away from our wedding. I certainly wasn't going to say no to my bride-to-be. So right. I said, okay, let's figure out how to flip a house. And we ended up flipping a house and 2 houses and 3 houses and 50 houses and 400 houses and 400 houses. And a decade later, we realized, okay, I guess we're real estate investors now. And ultimately, we moved into development and then multifamily.
Oh, cool. And so curiosity, where were you on the West? Were you on the West Coast?
So we worked in Silicon Valley on the West Coast, and then we moved back to the East Coast after that and got into real estate. We lived first in Atlanta, then outside of Washington, D.C., and now we're on the West Coast of Florida.
West Coast of Florida. Okay, great. All right, so you got into flipping and you did 400 houses.
Yeah, we did a little over 400 houses, and we realized that we're actually pretty good at it. The funny thing is, we knew nothing about real estate. I mean, literally when we moved in our mid-30s to the East Coast from Silicon Valley, we bought our first house. So I had never owned a house until I was 36 years old, 37 years old. Certainly knew nothing about investing in real estate. But what we both were really good at was the business side of things. She managed marketing for eBay. I was a manager for technology at Microsoft. And so we were both used to managing large teams and kind of running the business side of things, even though we knew nothing about real estate. So that kind of forced us to build our real estate business like a business. Neither of us had any interest in working in the business. We didn't want to do our own contracting. We didn't want to do anything ourselves. We basically wanted to hire people who were a lot smarter than we were. And then we focus on the strategy and the vision for the business. And so I think that's what allowed us to scale to where we did, just the fact that we never pretended to know anything about real estate, and we had to manage it like business owners, not like in the trenches real estate people.
Wow, that's such a interesting insight that you ran it like a business. The fact that you didn't know much about real estate may have served you.
Very much so.
That's amazing. And did you mention that this was like in 2008? Were you dealing with the wake of that downturn?
We were very fortunate. So yes, we were dealing with it, but the worst of it had probably already happened before we jumped in. We started the summer of 2008. Certainly we saw like another 10 or 15% drops in the markets that we were in. But the worst of it, the big 20 to 30% drop that we saw at the beginning of 2008 had already happened. So at that point, I mean, everybody says that there are good times to flip houses and bad times to flip houses. The reality is there are some really bad times to do it. But in general, it's either a buyer's or a seller's market, which means it's either going to be easy to buy and hard to sell, or it's going to be hard to buy and easy to sell. And back in 2008 was definitely different than what it was up until, I guess, a few months ago, but it wasn't any easier or harder. It was just different. It was harder to sell. It was really hard to sell. I mean, back in 2008, 9, and 10, we'd put a house on the market and we'd have to go through 3 or 4 contracts before we found a buyer who was qualified to get a mortgage. So selling was really tough as opposed to over the last few years where selling was really easy. But on the flip side, buying was simple. I mean, I could literally print out the MLS and take a dart and throw it, and whatever it hit was probably a deal that I could make work. So we got really, really good at the selling side of things. We got really good at the marketing. We got really good at building relationships with real estate agents and building relationships with buyers, knowing exactly what buyers in our market wanted, because literally there were 3 houses that were going to sell in a month in our market. And if we didn't have the exact thing that our buyers wanted, ours wasn't going to be one of the 3 houses that sold. So we got good at all of those things that ended up helping us later, even if the other side, the buying side, was really simple at the time. And so moving into 2018, 19, 20, yeah, we had to learn the whole buying side of things, but we kind of mastered the other side because that's what we struggled with when we started.
Right. That's interesting. I always think that I never flipped. People ask me, are you a flipper? Have you ever flipped? And I always say no, but there was one that I did flip and I kind of backed into it. I was going to buy a house in 2008, 2010. When I was in 2008 in that downturn, I thought I was going to move into the house that I would own for the rest of my life with my family during this downturn, and I would wait for the bottom. And I ended up buying this house, and then I quickly decided I didn't want that commute. And I knew, like, I had been on the show Family Guy, and I knew I'd be there for a long time. And it was like a 40-minute commute, but it was on an acre of land in LA, but it was just a little bit outside the city. So I figured, oh, I'll flip this. It's a beautiful place and it's run down. And I did my flip. I did one flip in my life. And I spent $700,000 on the flip and I made $5,000 in profit.
Hey, it was profitable. There you go. You can say that every flip you have ever done in your life has been profitable. There you go.
Squeezed out. Yeah, just barely.
Yeah, and I'll be honest, if I had to do it all over again, I would not have flipped houses. I certainly wouldn't have flipped nearly as many houses as I did. I think the biggest thing I've learned over the last 15 years is the value of long-term hold. And so I look back and I realized it might be kind of cool to say I flipped 400 and some houses, but from a financial perspective, I left a whole lot of money on the table by doing so. And we paid a whole lot more in taxes than we ever had to pay.
Yeah, you probably sharpened a skill set very much so doing that.
Yeah.
So it's not lost. You got the experience, but I guess
True.
I agree with your point, owning assets. That's how you build wealth.
Yeah.
So you made a pivot.
We did. So
yeah, go ahead. Talk about
no,
that.
I was just going to say, we make a lot of pivots. And I'd like to think that one of the reasons we've been successful over a decade and a half so far is that we've been able to pivot. We do a good job. Again, part of the whole not being down in the trenches of real estate, but kind of being able to see things from a more holistic business and economic standpoint. It really allows us to kind of not just focus on what we're doing today. Obviously, you have to focus on what you're doing today, but also spend some time kind of pontificating on what's going to happen a year from now and 2 years from now and 5 years from now. And that's kind of always informed our decisions on when and how to pivot.
Right. Yeah. What do they call that? They call that like the 10,000 foot view, something.
Exactly. So don't get so in the weeds of what you're doing that you ignore like what's going on around you.
What's going on? Exactly. Yeah. That's a great point. Yeah. So how did you make the transition?
So for me, it's always been about you keep doing what you're good at and you start moving into something else, hopefully early enough that you have time to get good at it and figure it out so that by the time you can no longer do what you're good at, either because the market won't allow you to or your situation won't allow you to, by the time you kind of have to give up that thing that you're good at, you're now good at something else. And so for us, I mean, it started with little things. Like 2008, we were buying foreclosures and there were foreclosures everywhere. And it was really easy to buy foreclosures. By 2010, we noticed it was getting a little bit more difficult to buy foreclosures. And my wife said, well, I'm starting to see that like there are a lot more short sales being listed on the market. Maybe we should figure out this whole short sale thing. And so 2010, we started looking into how do you do short sales. We brought a short sale negotiator onto our team. And while everybody else was kind of chasing the last of the foreclosures, we had moved into short sales. And so at this point, we had figured out how to get buyers to sign on and how to negotiate with the banks. And so by 2011 or 12, everybody was talking about, okay, I need to figure out short sales. We were kind of already ahead of that curve. And then by 2012 and 13, at that point, we were thinking, okay, short sales are starting to dry up. We need to figure out this whole thing called off marketing and basically getting deals off market. So using abandoned signs and using direct mail and using cold calling. And nobody else was thinking about this at that point because everybody was focused on foreclosures and short sales. So we kind of said, okay, let's kind of figure this out. And it gave us a year or two to figure out direct mail marketing. And so for several years, we were kind of ahead of everybody else in direct mail marketing because we kind of saw the trend away from the short sales and the foreclosures. And then in 2014, my wife said, I'm starting to see flipping. And you'll notice the trend here. It's always my wife kind of prodding me and saying, hey, you got to notice these trends. But she basically said the flips just aren't as good as they were. But what I'm starting to see is a lot of people listing infill development. So basically people buying lots, knocking down the houses, building new houses and reselling them. And she's like, I'm starting to see more of that. Maybe we should be looking into that. So 2014, we got into single family ground up development. And so again, we were a year, 2 years ahead of the curve. By 2016, everybody was doing that. So 2016, when I didn't want to compete with everybody doing that, I started looking into what's going to be next.
Sure.
And at that point, multifamily started looking very promising. I reached out to a good friend of mine, Ashley Wilson, who had been doing multifamily for a couple of years. And I basically said, hey, I'll make you a deal. If you'll mentor me for a year, basically, I'll give you a year of my time, my money, my network, my resources, my effort, anything you need. And she said, it's a deal. And so for a year, she mentored me. I helped her in her business, and we ended up working really well together. And in 2019, we started partnering, and now we have a multifamily syndication business together.
That's amazing. So you were very skilled, had a wide skill set at the time, and you had the humility to offer your services just to learn.
100%.
Pretty remarkable.
Yeah, so many people, they want to learn, but they don't have the patience. It has to be, I need to do this today and I don't want to pay for it and I don't want to give anything in return. I mean, people don't think that, but at the end of the day, that's how it comes across. And my attitude has always been, whether it was college, whether it was learning a new skill, I mean, in some way, shape, or form, you're going to have to pay for it. It doesn't have to be cash, but you're going to have to pay your dues. And so for me, volunteering my time for a year was just a no-brainer for the opportunity to learn from somebody who was doing exactly what I wanted to do and was doing it really well.
Right. And you clearly had the long view. A lot of people, they look at, for the next year, I'm going to go backwards and be a student hanging around with this person. But you were looking at the 10-year horizon and realizing what you could get from it.
Absolutely. Yeah. I like to think I'm always a student and I'm always learning. And if you're not learning, you're not growing.
I love that. Great way to be. And so that happened, you said it in 19? Was it 2019?
2019, we started working together. 2020, we did our first big deal together, and the rest is history.
Okay. Awesome. And how did that go? So you were in 2020, just when the stability of the prior 6 years just evaporated, and we've had drama ever since.
Yeah, it was interesting. So the first multifamily deal, so Ashley had done several deals before I joined, but the first one that we did together, we actually got under contract end of February 2020, possibly the worst time in history to have a property under contract. A week later, we scheduled our flight to go out for due diligence and everything shut down. So we literally couldn't complete our due diligence because COVID hit. So literally our due diligence trip was canceled because of COVID. And so for the first time ever, and we like to say we've never backed out of a deal. If we do a deal and the seller is honest with us, we're going to move forward no matter what happens. Unfortunately, for the first time, because of COVID, we had to basically put the deal on hold. The nice thing was 2 months later, the seller calls us back and says, hey, we're kind of through the worst of it. Are you guys still interested in this deal? And we said, yeah, let's make it work. And so June of 2020, that deal that we had to cancel got back under contract and we closed in September.
Amazing. What did that deal, what size was that and where was it?
Yeah, it was 152 units in Houston, Texas, apartment complex in Houston, Texas.
Oh, awesome. Just that you're bringing Talking to you, you're bringing up old thoughts and memories of mine. We were in Austin under contract in spring of 2020, and we went to inspect, and everything was shut down. Everybody had to wear masks. It was the first sort of weekend of mask wearing. And during our inspection, one of the inspectors tested positive for COVID. Everybody freaked out. And we finished the inspection, went back, and our lender was freezing up and we backed out. You had a little more nerve than we did. But
yeah, it was a tough time and we knew that there was a risk. But again, we were fairly confident that multifamily was a good place to be for the next 5 years. And honestly, our thought was, yeah, COVID could really hurt the real estate industry for a couple of years, but our time horizon for this deal was 5 years. And we were pretty confident that given 5 years that we were going to see things return and we were going to see that our business plan could play out. And I think we did a good job of convincing our investors of the same thing. They were certainly a little bit skeptical, but they kind of bought into our vision. And obviously with COVID, everybody was surprised and things didn't play out the way we expected back in the summer of 2020. And then things went on a tear for the next 2 years.
right. Yeah, that's interesting. And so you had to deal with the investors. How we didn't have to do that. What were those conversations like back then? I'm sure a lot of anxiety and a lot of fear and hesitation.
Absolutely. And so one of the things that we always try and align our interests with our investors. So with this deal, one, we put in a bunch of money on the LP side. So our investors knew that if things blow up, we don't just get to walk away. I mean, we had a lot of money. We had 7 figures invested of our own in this deal. So that was a big part of it. And secondarily, basically, we structure our deals like a lot of syndicators. I'm sure you do the same thing. We structure our deals in a way such that we don't really make much money, if anything, unless and until our LPs do. And so we really tried to send the message that, look, we're not taking anything from this deal unless you make it. So we cut our acquisition fee and we basically increased our pro formas and our waterfall on the back end so that our LPs were kind of guaranteed, and I hate to use the word guaranteed, but they were guaranteed to make more before we made anything.
Sure.
And so that kind of aligned our interest and sent the message that we're willing to be in this with you and we're not just looking to gamble with your money.
And they probably looked to you as an expert and you were willing to take those risks, take down on those risks. So maybe that gave them confidence as well. Did you have to, what was the guarantor? I remember the guarantor situations made me a little nervous when all this was first happening.
So for that deal, we actually brought in a third party, somebody super high net worth who signed on the loan for us. After that deal, we've been signing on all our own loans. But for us, it's one of those, it's the nice thing about commercial real estate and the larger stuff is most of the loans are non-recourse, so long as you're not committing fraud or doing something else to lie to the bank. So the hardest part is really just gaining that net worth and liquidity value that the banks are willing to let you sign on the loans. And I think for us, that's kind of been one of the game changers now that we've brought on another partner. We basically have the net worth and liquidity between all 3 of us to sign on any of the deals that we do. And so it gives us more control. It also allows us to keep more of the equity.
Do you consistently either go recourse or non-recourse, or do you bounce back and forth between them?
So we always do non-recourse when it's possible. That said, we had a deal. Unfortunately, it just fell through for various reasons, but we just had a deal that came up a couple months ago where we realized that we could get about 2 points lower on our interest rate if we were to do partial recourse. And again, we always look to kind of do the right thing for our investors. So we were happy to sign on a partial recourse loan to get the interest rate down. Unfortunately, that deal didn't go through for other reasons, but we're open to signing on recourse debt if we believe in the project, and we won't do a project we don't believe in.
Right. And I've agonized over recourse versus non-recourse because it's always a better loan if you go
Absolutely.
recourse. And
it can be tough historically up until the last few months, like when rates have really been going up. The difference in rates between recourse and non-recourse probably hasn't justified the additional risk. But these days, it's a question we should all be asking.
Right. Yes. And also a question that another syndicator emailed me about is they were having some issues with their loans that was getting pulled and changing. Obviously, we're in a changing economic environment. And I asked him, I said, are you in a single action state? And that's something that becomes a consideration with a lot of investments that we make, because we're tempted to go with the recourse version, but covering our risks and knowing whether it's a single action state helps make that decision.
Absolutely. And keep in mind, there's in between, there are partial recourse loans where you're on the hook for some percentage of the loan under certain circumstances, but not on the hook for the entire loan. And so there are some hybrid loan options out there that can give you a cut in interest rate, but also not as much as exposure as you get for a full recourse loan.
Great. And where did you guys go from there?
So from there, basically the goal is we want to build up a large portfolio. So our goal is $1 billion in assets under management in the next 5 years. We are at a little over 100 million now, so we have a long way to go, but I think we've been very comfortable with our growth. We tend to be pretty conservative. We're not going to do any deals that we're not willing to put our own money in, but we've been very fortunate that we have some very loyal and happy investors, and we're starting to get some more deal flow now that we're a couple of years in and building relationships with some of the larger brokers in the markets that we're in.
That's great. And you mentioned that first deal was in Houston?
Yep.
Okay. And tell me about your markets and also like what your criteria is. What do you look for?
Yeah, so we are big on data and market analysis. So basically, we like to run all the numbers up front to see what markets we want to be in for the next 5 to 10 years. And kind of everything we've looked at, from population growth trends, employment growth trends, employment diversity, absorption rates, and housing starts, everything has kind of led us to Houston as a great place to be for the next 5 to 10 years. So I know that a lot of people in our business are kind of less picky on markets and are more interested in deals. For us, we're really big fans of Houston, and we feel like because we know the market really well, it allows us to kind of move quickly on deals that we see. The downside is that we don't get to see as many deals as somebody who's willing to look in 5 or 10 different markets. So we've been very happy with Houston. We typically look for properties that are 150 units plus, built after 1980, between 1980 and 2010. Most of our deals are Class B properties that we raised to B plus or A minus properties, garden style or low rise.
Okay. And, despite maybe not having the diversity of various geographic regions, what you do have in Houston is a huge market with a ton of inventory. So you could pick off great deals probably all day long.
Absolutely. Yeah. Houston is like being in 4 different markets. I mean,
Right.
so many different parts of Houston, and there are advantages and disadvantages to each, but we believe that most of them are good areas. And so it really is, if you're in Austin, it's like one big metro, but Houston's kind of like 4 different metros.
Yeah. You probably have the same situation as I do is when people say, and I've diversified outside of LA, but I was in LA for 12 years exclusively. And people would say, like, how do you invest in LA? And I'm like, LA, it has 20 million people in it. And I think they have 3 million apartment buildings. I can find a great deal on an apartment building in an hour. There's always, every day of the week, there's a deal out there. You just got to find it.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, the nice thing about being in one market or 2 markets, when I tell people to specialize or focus, the other benefit is you really get the chance to build strong relationships with brokers. A lot of our deals are coming through brokers. And what I found is if you kind of put in 25% effort on building those relationships with brokers, sorry. You spend 25%, 50% of your effort building relationships with brokers, you're never going to find any deals. You really need to put in 100% effort over months and years to build relationships with the top brokers. And that's when the deals start to come. And so it's one thing that's focusing on one market has really allowed us to do.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Building those relationships. I don't know if you've ever gone down the direct to seller approach, but it seems hard. And sometimes I feel like we're lazy, but we've leaned heavily on the broker relationships.
Yeah, what we found is that if you're doing the 20 to 80 unit deals, direct to seller makes a lot more sense. or at least make some sense, because you tend to have less sophisticated sellers, more mom and pop type owners, as opposed to when you get into the 100+ units. I mean, at that point, you're probably working with some sophisticated sellers who own a bunch of different complexes. And at that point, they recognize the value in bringing in a broker, and they're probably not going to negotiate with you without a broker on their team.
Right. That's a good point. So I know you mentioned Ashley, and she's great. She was on the podcast and she was so good, so much info. Who else is on your team?
Yeah, so our core team is 4 of us. So it's Ashley, myself, and then 2 people that are kind of on our quote unquote board of directors. Ashley's husband, who basically is our lead underwriter. And then another gentleman named Cal, who kind of is a longtime investor. He's invested all over the world. He owns property, all commercial and residential property, and kind of works as a consultant for us, and also has just been a great advisor. And then on top of that, we have a team of about 8 employees, from everything from underwriting to marketing to analysis, due diligence, and asset management.
Okay. Are most of those your team in Houston?
Nope. Actually, we have 0 people in Houston other than our property management team, which is a third party.
Okay.
All of our team is spread out around the country. We've got a couple of people in Philadelphia, a few people in Florida, 1 in LA, so kind of everywhere.
Sure. Where are you based and where is Ashley based?
So Ashley's in Philadelphia and I am in Sarasota, Florida. So the West
Oh, that's
Coast.
right. You mentioned that. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Awesome. Well, this has been really good. Are you ready for a couple round?
Let's do it. This is what I'm looking forward to.
Yeah. All right. Here we go. The book you've recommended most over the past year.
Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman.
Okay. That's a good one. Is there an online tool or app that brings you the most value?
Online. So online is just something that changed my life. Just the access to data day in and day out. So I'm a huge data guy. Just to be able, I track the economy and I track markets, and just the ability to get access to data at my fingertips. I probably spend more time on, there's a website called Fred, or the St. Louis Fed. And basically you can go there and you can type in any metric you might want to see and it'll graph it for you. Any economic data point, and it'll graph it for you. And I probably spend an hour or 2 a day, like just overlaying different economic data points on top of each other just to see trends. So if I had to pick one, I would probably say the St. Louis Fred website.
Yeah. That's a good one. Yeah, I know I was going to ask you that in the body of this interview. Is I know you always seem to be so knowledgeable and on top of very current economic data. And I wanted to ask what your sources were for that. And it's Fred. Are there others as well?
Yeah, it's funny. Everybody asks me, what sources do I use? And the honest answer is I don't have a list of sources. What I recommend everybody do is find the smartest people around you. And whether they're investors or entrepreneurs, I mean, people that are interested in the economic data or investing or whatever it is, find the smartest people around you. And I just have WhatsApp groups on my phone. And when somebody in my group comes across some economic data point or something, some news thing is released, they just put it in the chat. And so I basically get the benefit of seeing like 10 other people, all the data that they're seeing and all the articles they're seeing and all the information they're seeing, and they get the benefit of what I'm seeing and sharing with them. And so my biggest recommendation there is just find some really smart people and say, hey, let's start a WhatsApp group or some message group and start sending around stuff that we find. And what you'll find is that like the power of 5 or 10 people to kind of dig up information is going to be so much more than what you can find yourself just digging around on the internet.
I love that. And you've also got 5 or 10 filters, people filtering through so that they're just going to send it or post the best.
Exactly. And they also end up being a mastermind group. I mean, something comes through and you're thinking of doing something, and you basically have a discussion about this data that came out and what it means and how we can leverage it to profit in our businesses. So you also get a mastermind group out of it as well.
I love that. Now I want to join your group.
Come on.
What was your favorite movie when you were 15?
Fletch.
That was great.
Yeah, I don't know if somebody was asking me about that last week, and I was thinking, does that hold up after 30 or 40 years? I'm not sure if it does. My kids are kind of getting to that age where I'm going to find out.
I wonder. Yeah, it's kind of fallen off the radar of a lot of like even comedy people.
Yeah, I think that all that physical comedy has kind of trended away over the last couple decades.
That's too bad. I love
I agree.
physical. Let me see. Aside from real estate, one thing you could spend all day talking about.
Ooh, that's a tough one. So certainly business or the economy, but I guess that's probably close to real estate. I used to be a semi-professional poker player, so I could talk about poker and certainly talk about technology, being a technologist.
Sure. I love that. I love your term. You're a technologist.
Yeah, that's kind of how I think about it. I can't say I'm an engineer anymore, but from a higher level,
Yeah,
I still love keeping in touch with all the technology that's out there.
I do too. I love reading the Economists
Yeah,
like technology episode. Just I want to see where the world's going.
absolutely.
What decade created the greatest music?
Oh, definitely the 80s.
The 80s. Okay. Who are
You
you
agree?
listening to? Uh,
You're
probably
90s guy.
not.
You're 90s, aren't you?
You know what? I grew up in Cleveland and we were like 2 decades behind everyone else in the music scene. So when I was in high school, like they were playing Leonard Skinner, like Cleveland could not get out of the 70s until maybe mid 90s. So decade, I don't know what I would say. Maybe the 90s,
Okay.
but also the 70s. I still like all that classic rock,
Yeah,
which
it's
makes
funny.
me
It's now that my kids are like just preteens, I find myself playing a lot of 80s music around them and saying, "This is what I grew up to." And so I don't do that as much with 70s and 90s music. So I guess that has to be my answer.
right, right. What's your most impressive, totally useless skill?
Oh, I can solve a Rubik's Cube.
How fast?
My best time is like a minute and 40 seconds.
Wow, that's amazing.
My kids are faster.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
So they've inherited your Rubik's Cube
No,
skill?
no, I've inherited theirs. They learned it before I did. And
Oh,
so
yeah.
they taught me.
You followed them.
I did.
All right. Here's a tough one. If you could have the answer to one question, what would it be?
Wow. Okay, I'm gonna answer this, but I need to think about it for a second.
Okay.
That's a really good question. If I can have the answer to one thing, I mean, I can say it's got to be cliche. I'm sure everybody says it, but wouldn't you like to know what happens after you die?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
Yeah,
No. Yeah. Sometimes it's a cliche for a reason. It's the
yeah,
biggest lingering question for all of us.
yeah. It's funny. I'm not sure I can think of a number two there.
Yeah. I mean, you could go down to, what's going to happen with the economy or something.
Yeah, but it just feels like there's
Future.
one, and then there's like
There's a
you got to go pretty far down to get to number two.
Yeah. There's a grand one question.
Yeah, certainly. I'm very interested in seeing how, I don't want to get political, but I'm curious to see how like everything that's going on today, geoeconomically and politically, kind of plays out over the next decade or two. I think it's going to be quite interesting.
Yeah. And for my own self-interest, I guess when I think about that is like technology, like medical technology, like will we extend lifespan? Will we, solve the big disease problems?
Yeah, we always assumed, I think when we were 20 years old and 30 years old, that, yeah, by the time we got old, like all those problems would be solved. We'd be living to 150. And now that I'm 50, it's kind of like, okay, we need to get on the ball here.
Yeah. Let's snap it up.
Yep.
When are you happiest?
When I'm just hanging out watching TV with my family, I think.
Yeah. I love that.
Yeah, we laugh together and it's just great.
It's a great way. If you're watching TV, it's likely at the end of the day. And what a great way to end the day. Cause I'm sure you, like myself, you're going 100 miles an hour all day long. And it sort of is a way to unplug.
Yeah, there's either 30 or 60 minutes every night that either I'll sit down with my kids and watch something, and you'll like this, but I'm almost ashamed to admit a lot of times it's Family Guy. And they might be a little young, but I don't care. Or with my wife, we'll sit down and watch a sitcom or a movie that we grew up with that we're like introducing to the kids. And it's just
I love
fun
that.
to watch their reactions to these things that we grew up with.
Yeah, that's so great. And lastly, how can listeners reach out to you?
Yeah, so if anybody wants to find out more, you can go to www.connectwithjscott.com, and that'll kind of link out to everything I have going on.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. This has been great.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. Thanks, Mark.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us for the Wild West Real Estate Show. If you like what we're attempting to do here, please subscribe so we can continue sharing these with you. And if you want to check out our website, it's quantumcapitalinc.com. You'll find podcast episodes as well as multifamily properties we're looking at and how you could potentially participate. Look forward to seeing you guys soon on the Wild West Real Estate Show.